On May 28, 1943, a hastily built light aircraft carrier slid into the Delaware River from the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. She was christened the USS Cowpens, a name borrowed from a small South Carolina town and a Revolutionary War battlefield. The ship's bell, engraved with that name, was a symbol of her identity, but for the men who would crew her, she was simply the Moo. She was a stopgap vessel, a cruiser hull topped with a wooden flight deck, and her designers had never planned for her to survive a direct hit. By August, she was steaming south through the Panama Canal, carrying a green crew and an untested air group toward the immense unknown expanse of the Pacific. Just before dawn on October 5, 1943, the Cowpens launched her first combat strike against Wake Island. From the bridge, McConnell watched as the dark shapes of the Hellcats lifted into the gray morning sky. Among the pilots were Bill Stanton and Graham McElwain, two friends from the fighter squadron Air Group 25. The strike itself was a success, pounding the Japanese airfield on the atoll. But an hour into the flight, the radio calls from Stanton and McElwain stopped. Their wingmen reported seeing one plane pull up hard and then just vanish into the clouds. No radio call, no smoke, nothing. The two pilots and their aircraft had simply disappeared. The Moo circled Wake for the rest of the day searching. Bob Price, a veteran pilot who had escaped Singapore the year before, stood on the flight deck scanning the empty horizon. He knew the statistics. A pilot down in the open ocean near a Japanese garrison had almost no chance of rescue. The search was called off at dusk. The ship had drawn blood against the enemy, but she had also lost her first men. That night, the crew understood the bargain they had made. The Moo was no longer a fresh ship on a shakedown cruise. She was a warship carrying dead friends in her logbook. The war had just begun for her. The air group pressed on regardless. Over the following weeks, the Cowpens pilots flew constant patrols and ground support missions. They strafed Japanese positions and blew up supply dumps. Bob Price led his division with steady authority. The ship's fighter director kept the Japanese bombers at arm's length. By the time the marshals were secured, the crew had shed its greenness. They had learned to work under fire, but the battles ahead would demand more. There was no time to dwell on the dead. The fleet turned west toward the next target. June 1944, the Cowpens was steaming with Task Force 58 toward the Marianas. Japanese fleet carriers were coming out to fight. On June 19th, the sky filled with attackers from both sides. Cowpens pilots threw their Hellcats into the swarms of enemy planes. They shot down many, but 5 of their own did not return to the deck. The battle was later called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier air power was broken that day. The Cowpens Air Group had performed well, but the losses stung. The ship maintained combat air patrols over the invasion fleet. The crew worked through exhaustion and the constant threat of enemy submarines. For weeks after, the Moo shuttled between strikes and refueling. The pace was relentless. Then in August, a new air group arrived. Fresh pilots and new aircraft came aboard. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Clem Craig, a quiet and determined fighter pilot. Craig was a veteran from the Independence. He had already seen combat and wanted more. Air Group 22 brought its own tensions. The ship's captain, Herbert Taylor, had clashed with the previous group. The new pilots found him distant and critical. But they had no time for morale problems. The next big operation was already being planned. The target, the Philippines, October 12, 1944. Cowpens launched strikes against Formosa. The Japanese resisted with heavy anti-aircraft fire. Torpedo bombers from VT-22 pressed home attacks despite the flak. Sherwin Goodman sat in the rear turret of an Avenger. He watched as enemy gunners threw up a wall of colored bursts. The planes got through. On the water, 2 American cruisers, Canberra and Houston, were torpedoed. Halsey formed a covering group called the Cryptiv, and Cowpens and Cabot provided air cover for the wounded ships. For days, Cowpens fighters intercepted Japanese attacks. On one mission, Clem Craig led his division into a formation of Jills heading for the Cripples. He shot down 3 in minutes. The air group accounted for 8 kills that day. Then came Leyte Gulf. On October 26th, Cowpens planes found the retreating Japanese center group. The Avengers, with Sherwin Goodman on a gun, dove on the light cruiser Noshiro. He saw torpedoes hit the ship. The crew felt a surge of pride, but the ship's officers were skeptical. Back at Ulithi, the strain between Captain Taylor and Air Group 22 finally broke. Taylor was relieved. On November 24th, Captain George DeBaun took command. He was a different man, outgoing, pipe-smoking, and direct. He restored morale with his humor and competence. The crew needed it. The kamikaze threat was growing, and the work was never done. Cowpens prepared for another operation. The date, December 1944. On December 18th, the Third Fleet sailed into Typhoon Cobra. The wind exceeded 120 knots. Cowpens rolled more than 50 degrees to starboard, her flight deck dipping into the sea. Planes broke their lashings and slid overboard. Captain DeBaun ordered the ship to heave to and used only the engines to steer. Down in the forward magazine, sailors wrestled with loose bombs. The ship groaned and shuddered. Every roll seemed like the last. A Hellcat tore loose from its moorings on the flight deck. It skidded across the wet planking, punctured its belly tank, and burst into flames. The fire spread fuel toward the hangar bay. Air Officer Bob Price gathered a volunteer team. They dragged hoses across the deck in the screaming wind. A massive roll sent seawater and men sliding. Price lost his footing and was swept over the side. The fire was put out, but Price could not be saved. The sea took him. When the storm cleared, Cowpens counted 3 men missing and 7 aircraft lost. The ship had survived, but Bob Price was gone. He had survived 11 days adrift after being shot down earlier that year. Now he was lost in a typhoon. The crew mourned. Captain DeBaun praised their courage and resilience. The Moo had faced her most dangerous enemy, the sea itself. She emerged battered but still afloat. The war would go on. On the morning of January 21st, 1945, the Cowpens was on station off Formosa. Clem Craig was leading 2 divisions of Hellcats on combat air patrol when the radar operator spotted a large group of bogies 50 miles out. The fighter direction officer gave them a vector. Craig led his 8 Hellcats into a high-speed descent and broke through the clouds at 6,000 feet. What they saw was not 4 enemy planes, but 18 Tojos, Oscars, and Zekas stacked in 4 groups like a flight of stairs. Craig slammed into the formation head-on and took out the first Tojo with a short burst to the cockpit. He then methodically worked his way through the enemy planes, picking off one after another. He got his second with a deflection shot, his third in a head-on pass, and the last 2 from behind and the side. The dogfight lasted less than 5 minutes. When it was over, 14 Japanese planes were confirmed splashed. Craig had destroyed 5 of them. He returned to the Cowpens with empty guns and the gun camera footage to prove every kill. The ready room erupted. In February 1945, the Cowpens joined Task Force 58 for the first carrier raids on Tokyo. The ship carried a new Air Group 46, undertrained and very green. The weather over Tokyo was terrible, solid overcast, sleet, and 40-knot winds. Pilots could barely find their targets. Many airfields were socked in, but they pressed their attacks, hitting aircraft factories and airfields wherever the clouds broke. The Japanese response was strangely muted. Few enemy fighters rose to challenge them. From Tokyo, the task force turned south to support the invasion of Iwo Jima. The island had been bombarded so heavily that most landmarks were obliterated. Pilots struggled to identify targets in the ash and rubble. On February 25th, a green pilot from Air Group 46 bounced his Hellcat over the crash barrier during landing. He plowed into the planes parked forward. 5 aircraft were wrecked. 2 deckhands were knocked overboard and lost. It was a grim reminder that the war still demanded a price in blood. After Iwo Jima, the Cowpens returned to the United States for a much-needed overhaul, then rejoined the fleet for the final strikes on Japan. By late July 1945, she was operating off Japan with Air Group 50. Lieutenant Commander Charlie Melhorn commanded the torpedo squadron. He was a survivor of a PT boat sinking off Guadalcanal and had little love for flying, but he led his men with steady discipline. In the preceding days, a young fighter pilot named Lee Nordgren had volunteered to attack the battleship Eyes with his wingman, diving through heavy flak to score near misses. On July 28th, Melhorn led his Avengers against the battleship Haruna at Kure. The flak over Kura was the heaviest the squadron had ever faced. Bursts of every color filled the sky. Ensign William Maguire's Avenger took a direct hit soon after releasing its bombs. It caught fire and plummeted into a village. Maguire and his crew were killed. The squadron had suffered its first combat casualties of the deployment, but the war was about to end. On August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki aboard the Cowpens. The news spread like wildfire. Pilots who had been briefed for another strike against the Shibara electric plant in Tokyo watched the clock, hoping for a reprieve. On August 15th, the ceasefire order came. The pilots jettisoned their bombs and pulled aerobatic stunts on the way back to the carrier. Admiral Halsey ordered the main brace spliced. The war was over. 3 weeks after the surrender announcement, the Cowpens steamed into Tokyo Bay as the first American carrier to anchor there. Admiral Halsey had selected her for this singular honor, perhaps remembering the day his daughter christened her hull. On the morning of August 30th, Captain Herbert Duckworth, who had only recently arrived aboard and would not formally assume command of the ship until September 10th, lifted off from the flight deck with 17 planes and 24 men. He landed at Yokosuka Airfield, walked into a small seaplane hangar, and accepted the formal surrender of the Japanese base. A Marine private first class named Bernard McCarty stood guard with a Thompson submachine gun, ready for treachery that never came. The Moo returned to San Diego on a crisp October afternoon, greeted by cheering crowds and a Navy band. After 26 months of war, 200,000 miles steamed, and 12 battle stars earned, her work was done. Her men scattered to their peacetime lives. Clem Craig retired from the Navy in 1962 as a double ace. Ed Haley returned to AT&T. Sherwin Goodman went home to a quiet civilian life. Admiral Robert P. McConnell, the Cowpens' first captain, retired as a vice admiral in 1953 and died in 1973. Captain Herbert Taylor was promoted to rear admiral before retiring in 1951. Captain DeBaun retired as a rear admiral in 1950. Anderson Bowers continued his naval career until 1962 and then worked as a stockbroker. Lieutenant Commander Charlie Melhorn retired from the Navy in 1961 and later earned a PhD in history. Fighter pilot Lee Nordgren returned to Minnesota, ran his family's camera business, and lived into his 90s. The Navy mothballed the ship in 1947, cocooning her guns and sealing her hatches against the California fog. In 1960, she was sold for scrap for little more than $250,000. The gallant lady who had never been hit by the enemy was cut apart at the breaker's yard. But the Mighty Moo did not disappear. Her veterans began gathering in the tiny town of Cowpens, South Carolina, for annual reunions. Local families adopted the old sailors as their own, and the festival grew into a tradition of handshakes in memory. In 1991, a new guided missile cruiser bearing the name Cowpens slid down the ways, her commissioning pennant fluttering in the spring breeze. An elderly carrier veteran stood at the pier and symbolically passed the watch to a young lieutenant. The words were simple. "I relieve you, sir," the old man answered. "The CVL veterans stand relieved. If you have a family story from the Pacific War, a letter from a grandfather, or a photograph tucked away in an album, we would be honored to hear it in the comments. We read every one. And if you would like to see more histories of the ships and the men who sailed them, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us keep telling these stories. Thank you for listening.